begin, welcome to the America First Policy Institute. AFPI was created a little over 270 days ago, and our purpose is fairly simple. We've gathered many of the great minds of the Trump administration to continue many of the successful policies and initiatives that define the America First movement. Every day, the men and women of AFPI work to change America for the better. We're out there crafting policy, counseling policymakers, amplifying activists, battling the media, and doing absolutely everything that we can to build an America where Americans come first. Unfortunately, what we see today from the Chinese government, as well as the current administration's policies, places the American people last and China first. China's lack of transparency in the early stages of COVID-19 led to a prolongment of the pandemic, for which the American people in the world are still facing today. The Chinese government continues to hide from public view the range of atrocities it commits against its own people, including genocide against the Uyghurs, violent suppression of political opposition in Hong Kong, and the repression of other religious minorities throughout the country. Last week and throughout the Olympic Games, we at AFPI have been publishing daily information on our social media channels, highlighting different aspects of China's threats and human rights violations for the simple reason that the truth does not get the attention it merits, particularly by the American corporations beholden to Beijing. So here we are today, Communist China, the world's leading human rights abuser, and the top threat to Americans and to many others around the world is given a global platform by hosting the Olympics. To help us understand what all of this means for our security and for our future, we have the privilege of hearing not only from one of the most eloquent voices on this topic, but one of the leading fighters of freedom in the country. Senator Scott needs little introduction. He has been serving the American people and the people of Florida since he joined the Navy as an active duty radar man. He returned to the people of Florida during his first two terms as the state's 45th governor, and since 2018 in the United States Senate. I had the opportunity to work firsthand with the senator, first as governor, responding to a number of hurricanes in the great state of Florida, as well as his time on the Government Affairs Committee as I was acting secretary. Amid the heightened attention around other foreign adversaries several years ago, Senator Scott was a leading voice to show us why China needs to be America's focus. In 2019, he visited Hong Kong in the wake of the protest, and for the past 2 years, the senator has been advocating for the International Olympic Committee to move the 2022 Olympic Games out of communist China into a country that actually respects human rights. Realizing the strategic importance of Taiwan, China's advancing aggression towards them, Senator Scott has progressed numerous initiatives to protect our ally against China's encroachments by advocating an end to America's policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome Senator Scott.
Jeff, thanks for the introduction. Congratulations on your success. I'm very hopeful that AFPI will be very successful and help when you're in the Senate. I think in any of these jobs, it's very helpful to have organizations that are continued and talk about the things that you know are important and get the message out and give us ideas of things we should work on. So thank you for the introduction, and I'm glad to be with each of you today. Last week, the opening ceremony for the 2022 Olympic Games aired on NBC. Think about it. Usually the opening, it's a nice thing. It's a way for a country to sort of talk about their culture and things like that. But there was a spectacle that day that we shouldn't forget. General Secretary Xi, and let's remember, he's not a duly elected president. He's General Secretary Xi of the Communist Party. Had a Uyghur athlete serve as a torchbearer and light the flame for the Olympic cult. It was a perfect example of the kind of propaganda Communist China is known for. They want to whitewash their crimes. That's exactly what they try to do every day. And this time they even got NBC's Samantha Guthrie to echo their talking points. It's hard to believe that they would do that. We all know that this year's Olympics are tainted. They're tainted by the genocide of Uyghurs in their homeland. They're tainted by the destruction of democracy in Hong Kong. They're tainted by labor camps and the ongoing persecution of Tibetan Buddhists and the continued harassment of Taiwan. They're tainted by the pandemic that Communist China started lied about, and then tried to cover up. I believe these games serve as a pivotal moment for freedom-loving countries and a possible inflection point for a global order, and I'm hopeful. For years, policymakers in Washington believed they could change communist China and bring them into the world community. The common thinking at the turn of the century was that entry into the World Trade Organization would expose communist China to Western values that the Chinese government would adopt, and that would lead to a greater level of freedom for its citizens and better for the world. It clearly hasn't worked. Communist China has used this position to manipulate markets, to lie, cheat, and steal. And that's exactly what the government of Communist China does. They lie, they cheat, and they steal. And fuels its evil regime's attacks on democracy. Think about where the status quo of cooperation with Communist China has brought us. Look at all this hard work trying to bring them into our Western values. Where are we? Right now, the regime is leading a genocide in the Uyghur homeland where more than 1 million Uyghurs are locked up in camps. You can't make this stuff up. Gross crimes like forced abortion and forced sterilization, which is disgusting, have been committed against Uyghur women to reduce the population of Uyghurs. Children are separated from their parents and pressured to renounce their Uyghur heritage. That's despicable. Video footage has shown blindfolded Uyghurs being loaded onto trains and transported to prisons. Human rights groups have indicated that Communist China is guilty of violating every provision of the United States or United Nations Genocide Convention. And the party has taken similar actions in Tibet, where they're putting hundreds of thousands of Tibetans into mass labor camps. I mean, why not? They've gotten away with the Uyghurs. They're persecuting and harvesting organs of those who practice Falun Gong. I recently heard from a young man whose 65-year-old mother is a Falun Gong practitioner. She was arrested last week, just days before the Olympics began. She's been taken to a detention center in Inner Mongolia and is on a hunger strike. Police have known about her since 1999 and have twice taken her to forced labor camps in 2001 and 2008. Both times she was severely tortured and beaten. The torture was so devastating, this is against a woman, that she had to be released on medical parole because she was so close to dying. She even suffered a heart attack during the 2008 detention caused by a condition developed during the 2001 torture. Then you look at the destruction of human rights in Hong Kong, and now she has shut down independent news outlets like Apple Daily and jailed pro-democracy activists like Joshua Wong, Martin Lee, and Jimmy Lai. And now you can't even run for office in Hong Kong without having Beijing's rubber stamp. We see how they're harassing Taiwan and militarizing the South China Sea and encroaching on waters belonging to Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Japan. You think about the Belt and Road Initiative, all that is a plan to drown developing nations in debt so they can form an economic bloc of partners. They don't have partners. They have only people that end up being subservient to them. Beijing props up dictators in Venezuela and Cuba. They refuse to abide by trade rules. Through their Thousand Talents programs, they steal our technology and take our trade secrets. Meanwhile, she is building up the military, consolidating power, and rooting out dissent. She has made clear that he doesn't want to merely compete on the global stage. He wants to set the terms of debate and isolate the US and our allies. You look at what they're doing, and you can't help but come to these two conclusions. Communist China has chosen to be our enemy. They made that choice, and we have entered into a new Cold War. Given these facts, you'd think that the US government would change its approach. Our leaders should be able to look at the previous 4 decades of cooperation and view it as a complete and absolute failure. President Trump did that. He understood that we could not treat Communist China like any other competitor. We had to treat them as an adversary, which they are. Sadly, the Biden administration has chosen not to follow President Trump's example. Joe Biden began by selecting some of the worst possible people imaginable to lead. For the chief diplomat to the United Nations and the head of the CIA, Biden picked 2 people who believe American diplomats should accept diminished roles in global affairs because they no longer believe in the power of the American example. Biden picked John Kerry, who will bend over backwards just so Beijing might marginally reduce its emissions in the next 50 years or so, while he's flying around on a private jet and lobbying against the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Then you think about how long this administration went on without saying anything about the Beijing Olympics. I asked President Biden to meet with me about the Olympics and the human rights abuses in communist China. I asked him to join me in calling for the games to be moved out of Beijing after the International Olympic Committee ignored my calls. You know what his response was? His response about everything, total silence. What's more, this administration has done nothing, absolutely nothing to hold Communist China accountable for failing to meet its end of the Phase 1 trade agreement. Janet Yellen has even criticized the tariffs on Chinese goods. You look at how Biden promised to buy American, but now he's using billions of American tax dollars to purchase Chinese-made COVID-19 tests. You can see that he's taken no significant action to hold General Secretary Xi accountable, none, for his attacks on democracy in Hong Kong, threats against Taiwan, or genocide against the Uyghurs. And now Biden is pushing a bill that's nearly 3,000 pages long and has almost nothing to do with countering communist China. He's an embarrassing appeaser in chief, and then he has the goal to ridicule Republicans because he says they do nothing. This administration can't do anything but lie and try to distract from the painful reality that every American is seeing. Joe Biden does not care. Instead of choosing to act with strength and promote American values, Joe Biden and Democrats in Congress have opted to placate and appease. Now, during the previous 4 years, under President Trump, the world began to wake up to the threat of communist China. He was tough, and you have to be tough with dictators like Xi. You think about what President Trump did. He exposed their unfair trade practices. He cracked down on TikTok and showed the threat it poses to our kids and to everyone's privacy. He removed Hong Kong's special trade status after General Secretary Xi's takeover of Hong Kong. It was a Trump administration that exposed communist China for their genocide and for their currency manipulation. The administration directed an all-of-government effort to stop and punish communist China's attempt to steal and profit from American technology and intellectual property. And the administration indicted major Chinese drug traffickers for distributing fentanyl in the US for the first time ever. I can think back to the many conversations with the Trump administration about the Peace Corps. Peace Corps had a big presence in communist China. I'm proud that we worked to get them out of there. We can see that President Trump shook everyone out of their fantasy about communist China coming to accept Western values. They are not. And opened the eyes of everyday Americans to the goals of that evil regime. He handed the Biden administration a proven playbook, but Joe Biden hasn't even bothered to give it a passing glance. So moving forward, what can we do? Here are 10 ideas. Look around. The majority thinks Americans use are made in communist China. An easy first step is for every American to start thinking about where things are made and stop buying anything made in communist China. Buy American, buy local whenever possible. But we can all have an impact by choosing to refuse to give communist China and their businesses any more money. It all flows to the Chinese Communist Party. Second, we have to stop giving US capital, our dollars, to Chinese-backed companies through our stock exchanges, investments, and index funds. We should get them out of retirement accounts and our pension plans. They refuse to be transparent about their accounting practices, and we shouldn't be putting Americans, investors, and retirees at risk. That's why I co-sponsored with Senator Kennedy Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which President Trump signed into law. Now it's holding Chinese firms accountable for their lack of transparency. Third, when researchers teach at our universities or work in our labs, we have to know exactly who they are. Too many spies from communist China have come into our ranks, and we cannot allow them to continue to steal our technology. And while we're at it, we have to get rid of the Confucius Institutes and anything like it in our schools. We know these are just avenues for Chinese propaganda to spread, and we should not stand for it. Fifth, we have to root out communist China out of our supply chains and bring manufacturing back to the US. COVID-19 showed us exactly what happens when you're over-reliant on communist Chinese manufacturers. And for the sake of our own national security and resiliency, we have to stop working with communist China. During the height of the pandemic, I introduced the American-Made Protection for Healthcare Workers and First Responders Act to ensure the US built its stockpile of PPE so our first responders and healthcare workers have everything they need, not made in communist China. Six, we need to face off against communist China in international institutions. We cannot continue to let Beijing and allow them into positions of power at the UN, at the IMF, at the World Bank, or at the Olympics. We should not be footing the bill for organizations that allow communist China to reshape the world according to Xi's agenda. When we see organizations help communist China cover up its abuses, we need to call them out and hold them accountable. That's why I introduced the Irresponsible Olympic Cooperation Act with Congressman Michael Walsh to strip the IOC of its tax status. Why would we give them a tax exemption when they're out supporting communist China? The IOC doesn't deserve a single dime of our taxpayer money or any benefit from our government. Seventh, we must hold accountable all of these corporate giants that love to play woke social justice warrior and trash talk conservatives here in the US, but then turn an absolute blind eye to genocide in communist China. All they care about is profits, 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 rather than human rights. I'm talking about Coke, Nike, Delta, NBA, you name it. We are done with their two-faced corporate hypocrisy. Eighth, we need to strip communist China of the permanent normal trade relations status and return to the pre-2001 system. I've co-sponsored the China Trade Relations Act led by Senator Tom Cotton just to do that. You know, they've never complied with any of this stuff. We've allowed Beijing to enter into the WTO. We have to tell them we're going to hold them accountable for refusing to play by the rules and pursue unfair trade practices. We let them in there, believing something would change. Now we've got to rein them in. Next, we need to end our policy of strategic ambiguity with regard to Taiwan. I've introduced the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act to make clear that we will come to Taiwan's defense if Beijing invades the island. And finally, we need to think about how they're penetrating our technology. I've introduced legislation to ban TikTok on government devices and prevent Chinese-made drones like those from DJI from being used by government agencies. You can't imagine. I mean, it's something like 85% of drones in this country are made by a Chinese company. What I'm talking about is a strategic economic and political decoupling with communist China. This is a new Cold War. We have to be clear-eyed about our enemies' intentions, their strategies, and their tactics. Before I conclude, I do want to explain something. I don't believe this is the Chinese people. It's the unfortunate regime they're under. This is an attack on General Secretary Xi and his genocidal regime. There are millions and millions of wonderful Chinese families. They don't want to live in a surveillance state. They want freedom just like we do, economic freedom, religious freedom, and political freedom. They want to live their lives free from government control just like us. But the Chinese Communist Party is committed to oppressing them. The Chinese people have had their liberties systematically eroded. I'm here to expose that fact. When Uyghurs and Tibetans and Hong Kongers and all those across mainland China are denied freedom and denied democracy, I'm here to be their voice. As Americans, we should be the greatest champions for freedom and democracy in the entire world. And we should welcome and empower everyone who wants to uphold the principles that made our nation the greatest nation in the world. We cannot allow Xi's influence to spread because communism is a cancer. We know that what's done in Cuba. We know what it did in Soviet Russia. We see it work with Maduro in Venezuela. And now we have the crazy thing. We have people in our country somehow saying socialism is good. We cannot let this spread. It will kill us just like it killed 100 million people in the 20th century. Communist China is the greatest threat to the freedoms that we love and enjoy. And in the foreseeable future, we have to treat them just as much until they change. Clearly, the Biden administration is not up to the task. So the rest of us have to fight hard and be ready when their time is up. The global order and status quo of freedom and democracy depend on our family, each of us, our freedom and liberties, our kids and our grandkids depend on. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, well, thank you, Senator. Great remarks. We're going to touch on a couple of the issues that you brought up. I think just a great crowd here. The event was sold out in a matter of hours. So it just tells you that I think a lot of people around town are starting to wake up to the threat of China, Chinese maligned influence here in the homeland, but also elsewhere. So again, thank you for being here. Let me just start off. You mentioned, obviously, the Trump administration took a different approach to China than the current administration. You listed off a number of initiatives. Thank you for doing that. But if the Biden administration was listening to you, and you could give them 3 things that they could do better today to help really, start to address this issue in a really comprehensive way? Kind of putting you on the spot here a little bit, but what would you advise them to do?
The first thing I think we need to do is we all have to be part of this. If we stop buying their products, if we stop visiting their country, it will have a devastating impact on their economy. My belief is we have to have the strongest economy in the world if we want to be the beacon of liberty. And we have to understand, if we continue to allow them to build their economy, we run these unbelievable trade deficits. I mean, all we're doing is helping sheep. So number one is we have to ourselves, each of us have to say, we have got to figure out where things are made, stop buying their stuff. Number two is talk about it. We need to make sure everybody knows exactly what they're doing. I mean, I'm so disappointed that NBC won't talk about the Uyghurs. I mean, it's disgusting when you see companies like Coke and Nike, and these people want to be NBA. They want to be these, woke warriors about us, which we are proving ourselves every day. And then they're okay with that. So I think the other thing is hold everybody we do business with in America accountable, and they'll stop doing it. Then the next thing we have to do is we have to be very aggressive on trade. If they're gonna go violate the rules, they are not gonna be part of the WTO. Why would we, I'm a business guy. If somebody lies to you, I mean, it's your fault you didn't catch that. But it's like, keep lying to you and you keep doing business with them, you're an idiot. That's what we're doing. We watch what they're doing. They lie. Well, how many of you thought there was any chance China would live up to the trade deal? None of us did. Why do we do it? Right? I mean, I'm glad that we did it, but then we got to be very aggressive and talk every day about it. And it matters if we talk about it. I mean, they watch what we're saying. They're scared to death of information that gets into their country. So we can win this if we're all, but we have to understand this is the biggest threat I think we've had since, I don't know, since the Second World War. I can't imagine a bigger threat than we have right now.
Well, I appreciate that. I think if you go back to 2018 and even 2019, when a lot of folks were talking about the threat from Russia, particularly as it leading up to our election, and there were a number of us, including yourself, including myself, when I was at DHS, talking about the threat from China and trying to outline it there. And I think it's funny, if you fast forward to where we are today, everyone's starting to talk about China. And so it's good that folks are coming around to the threat.
So when I was growing up, we didn't buy things from Russia. Right. We knew they were a threat.
Yeah.
Right. We were practicing, getting into bomb shelters.
That's exactly right. You brought up, big multinational corporations like Coca-Cola, Nike, and others. These are companies that are very quick to condone actions here in the U.S., particularly from conservatives, but definitely here in the U.S., but are not willing to do that really when it comes to actions that the Chinese Communist government is taking. Why do you think that is?
Because we don't hold them accountable. Why would you do business with somebody that attacks you? I mean, that's what we do. I mean, you sit there and you watch Coke and Delta and Nike, the NBA. They sit there and attack our values that this country is built on these values, and then we go do business with them. Stop, and they'll stop. So I mean, I'm so disappointed that they care about money. That's all they care about. I mean, it starts with the NBA. So they want to be woke warriors here, and they're okay with all the bad things happening in China.
Yeah, that's a great message. Let's pivot a little bit. Obviously, we're in the middle of the Olympics. I think some folks are watching, others are not. You've been an outspoken critic and really, talking a lot with the IOC over the last several years. Can you give us, I don't want you to tell us everything. Can you give us a sense of how those conversations went? I know you've had phone calls, you've had letters with them.
I've had letters, I've had phone calls.
What are their concerns? I mean, are they concerned about the human rights abuses that we see in China today, about the Uyghurs?
They'll say they are. I mean, if you look, I think most of the letters have gotten a bit public. I mean, they'll say they are, but actions speak louder than words. I mean, they haven't done anything. They don't call them out. So I always think, life is, what are you doing, not what you're saying. And they're not doing anything, and they won't do anything. And so, they're gonna, they'll have time as soon as these Olympics finish. Maybe they'll change. I hope they are. I'm always optimistic, right, that people will change. But I'm very disappointed that NBC's not put more time into it. talking about the genocide. I mean, let China kick them off. I mean, these are American companies with primarily American stockholders, with American employees. I mean, NBC didn't even take their employees to China because it's too dangerous.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Such a good
But
point.
I always say that they never cared. And they never cared. And then they won't even talk about what they're doing to make sure athletes are safe and how the athletes are safe over there. You know, they got these quarantine hotels. Have you read about those? I mean,
this is probably, you know, at least in my lifetime, from an Olympic standpoint, usually people look forward to watching this. This is probably one of the least hyped and least watched Olympics that probably we'll ever see.
Yeah, we love the Olympics. And you know, we love to follow athletes, and we're so excited for them because they busted their butts to get there. And I mean, this complete Olympics is changing.
I think it's important we continue to you know, support American athletes there, but for a variety of reasons which you outlined, probably should never happen in China.
Yeah.
Let me pivot.
We should boycott.
2019, I brought it up. You visited Hong Kong. Can you give us a reason? Give us an idea. Why'd you go? What'd you see? And a little insight into that trip.
Well, the goal is to support the people that are standing up. I'm very appreciative of the people in Hong Kong that were willing to go out there and protest. You know, and you know, and worried about their own safety. And we could see it when we were over there. And so, you know, we have, if we don't stand up for people that are putting their lives on the line, because they are. I mean, you know, the government there wanted to kill them. And you know, people disappear in Hong Kong. They disappeared in Hong Kong before they took away all their basic rights. People are disappearing. And so I think we have to do everything we can. The easiest thing is to give a speech about it, but the other thing is show up. The way I look at it is, I'm in a job that's a fleeting job. I will have this opportunity for the number of years I'm in the US Senate. I should take that opportunity to use this position to highlight the things that we all believe in. I believe in human rights. And I believe if we don't stand up for human rights worldwide, eventually we won't have human rights here. And so I think it was important to do it. I was, I got to, you know, I'd met some of them before, but it was really a wonderful trip. And then a lot of them have come over here since. But, you know, you have to, you know, Martin Lee, just his whole life has been to fight for freedoms. And, you know, Joshua Wong is younger, but his life has been that way. And then Charlie Lai, here's a guy that, you know, he's lived the dream. He got out of China and came as a kid, and I think it was his kid, and built a great business, and when he get back, and now he's in prison. So we've got to do everything we can and use every avenue we have. We use social media. When we talk about it on TV, talk about them every day.
So let's pivot real quick. One more question here for you. I know you've got a busy schedule. Action going on in the Congress. I know we have China bills both in the Senate and the House. I believe they passed both chambers. You've been critical about them. You've obviously outlined a number of bills that you supported during your remarks. Give us an idea of why, you know, whether it's the Compete Act or Competes Act or other legislation, why that's not the right approach.
I'm a business guy. If you lent me money, you expect to get interest and your money back, right? If you invest in my company, you expect to make some money on it. So I expect, if we're going to spend your money, we ought to get a return. There's no return in those bills. There's no, so it's like, I've been up here 3 years, and on all the bills I say, okay, so let's pay for results. That's sort of how business works, right? What result we're going to get? No idea. Were we for sure going to move all the semiconductor industry to the United States? No idea. Are we? I mean, what research we're going to get? I mean, we're throwing a bunch of money. There's no accountability in the Senate bill, and the House bill is worse. And in the House bill, you get all that plus Green New Deal, right? So I'm tired of not getting a return. When I was governor of Florida, there's 4,000 lines in the budget. I walked in with a $4 billion budget deficit. I balanced it. I didn't balance it by raising taxes. I cut the size of government. And I actually started cutting taxes every year. And we went through every line of the budget, and we had a written purpose for that line. And if it didn't make it, I vetoed the money the next year. That's what we've got to start doing here. We have to get results. Every dime, if we say we want to compete with China, there's stuff to do. Can we help the semiconductor industry? Absolutely. But you know what? They're not broke. They're not broke. buy their stock, right? And so why would we just throw money with no accountability there and give money to our universities? There's no, I mean, it makes you mad. We're sitting here, you see, we've got $30 trillion worth of debt. Right, $30 trillion worth of debt. Who can pay for this? And then they want to pass bills with we get nothing. I can't tell you anything we would have gotten for it. It would have felt good. Oh yeah, we did something. I'm not sure what it was. So I'm going to keep fighting all this stuff until we get an accountable government.
Well, that sounds like a lot of common sense, which we know is lacking sometimes in the halls of Congress. So thank you for being here. You're a champion of liberty, of freedom, but also just a leading advocate when it comes to calling out China for the threats that they're imposing here on the homeland and elsewhere. So thank you again. Thanks for the invitation. Have a great day. Bye-bye. We're going to transition to our panel. We're going to have Steve Yates, who is the chair of our China Policy Initiative. He's going to run our panel. We also have Jack Brewer, chair of our Center for Opportunity Now, also NFL great. He's going to talk about his experiences visiting China over a number of years and have a little conversation here.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
you very much, everyone, for coming today. This is an event and a subject area that's very near and dear to my heart. And I'm just honored to be here with the America First Policy Institute family and to be able to launch our new China Policy Initiative with this kind of a conversation. Now, many of you are here because the Olympics is happening and we have questions about how do we root for Team USA and still make sure that the American people are able to see through the show to some hard truths about communist China that we all need to be able to understand and face. At AFPI, we aim to take a different kind of approach to the challenges that come from communist China. I hope you'll feel it from the kind of conversation that we have, but it's because China presents a very different kind of threat today than others America has faced in the past. Senator Scott's eloquent remarks pointed to a lot of the key reasons why it's a different kind of a challenge. One is because, sadly, the United States helped nurture this existential threat to our way of life by an overly accommodating policy for many, many decades. The other reason it is a different kind of threat and a challenge is that it is a part of a lot of our everyday lives in ways we haven't really, for lack of a better way of putting it, sobered up to that presence of these influences. And so today, we have an opportunity to have a very different conversation about China, some of the hard truths. We are going to talk about a subject matter that touches all of our lives that we've heard about a lot in America, but has been absent from the conversation about the Olympics and China. And that is one of the role of race, so discussions about the concept of systemic racism, some of our personal experiences, but then also what are some of the things, given the very different role that Chinese Communist Party influence can play in the United States itself, that we as a broad team and our citizens that are motivated to take action, they can do before having to waiting for the right kind of legislation to come from Congress and the right kind of administration to come into the White House to pick up with the broader transition on our approach to China. So with that, I hope you will follow what we do through this new China Policy Initiative. And I hope that we are good examples of how to have an all of society conversation and approach to meeting this challenge. The Communist Party of China uses every vehicle of influence at its disposal, from access to entertainment and media, access to academia, access to Wall Street and financial elites, all ways to permeate our society and pillars of influence. And we as Americans, not just in government, but beyond government and out in the States, need to come up with ways where we see the truth and find ways to push back about some of the things that are done against us. Now, I will just share a little bit of why I brought up the concept of systemic racism in regard to a conversation about China. The Communist Party of China is one of the few very big networks in the world that actually uses race as a means to oppress its own people in the manifestation of the genocide against the Uyghurs, but not limited to that, but also militarizes race through its United Front approach to have ethnic Chinese people in other parts of the world place their allegiance first to the party before God and before the countries in which they are citizens. And then beyond that, there's the corrosive influence of taking down some of our institutions, and their diplomats now voicing some of the harshest critics of America's founding and America's values right in the face of American officials. And our officials have not had a response. So today, with my wonderful colleagues, Jack and Chad, we're going to try to talk through what some of our personal experience has been with this. I can't think of a more appropriate friend and colleague to have in the conversation right now than Jack, given that we have the Olympics. Last I checked, that was sports. Jack has had the opportunity to come and go to China several times, has some personal experience, but then also can speak to this from a cultural point of view about what I described about the woke logic coming to the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Chad had the nice, simple, easy job of keeping America safe. And oftentimes when we talk about China policy, it's usually about the State Department, the Defense Department, trade, treasury, all important. But there's a really important role understanding the new challenge in our homeland. And so with that, I want to focus on our cultural institutions and invite Jack to take up the mic. Now, some of you are going to recognize that he's, of course, an NFL great that was the captain for the Vikings, the Giants, and the Eagles. And I already confessed that having grown up in this area, I may not have rooted for his teams. But now that I know Jack even better, I will always be rooting for Jack. But Jack, please take it from me.
I appreciate that, brother. Thank you. As we know, we have our own issues that many of us are facing here in our country when it comes to race, when it comes to justice. Many call it social justice. I prefer to look at my justice through the lens biblically, to speak, to be frank. But when it comes to China, it is a unique situation. You know, I call it convenient social justice. You know, for me, it's disheartening when I see our athletes here that represent our country, that live in our country, that are able to enjoy the freedoms of our country when we go to other places, and all of a sudden that social justice does not become convenient anymore, and they change their tone. And so what that does is it leaves people who are oppressed without a voice, with no one standing up for them. And so I take those things very seriously. I have worked my entire life working with the most underserved people on the planet and trying to be the voice of reason and truth to help uplift those individuals out of poverty, particularly taking on the horrific racist doctrines that are going on in places like China. I went to China, actually. I was one of the first to go to China to bring a delegation of National Football League players there. Welcome with great regard. Everyone wanted to come in, but as I continued to take my trips there, I started to get more ingrained with the normal folks and understand what really goes on in China. And the way that, and the perspective that they had towards the African man, the Black man that would come, was really shocking to me. You know, I grew up, both of my parents went to segregated schools here in America, but I never thought I'd see a sign that said no blacks on the storefront. And I saw that there. And so it started to become real. I started to understand really what it means to be communist. And then as I started to do more and more research and understand that religious persecution in China happens like you've never seen before. And so as you start to understand those things, you start to realize that, you know, if you can take spirituality out, if you can brainwash people, then you can pierce their hearts. And it's easy to go along with these crazy views of cleansing and looking at skin color and really systematically putting those things in place. But what it also did is it made me realize that the talk of America being systematically racist just aren't as true like that, like it is in China. I started to understand, and I started to understand how other people around the world are living in issues that are affecting people of color. And so for me, it was just an overwhelming moment to really get a deep understanding and appreciation for what we do here in our country. And so from that experience, I wanted to make sure that I could become a voice of reason, which again, as I go back to the NBA or to any other league that goes over to China and embraces that culture, you really have a responsibility to stand up for those folks that are being persecuted at the level that they're being persecuted in China. And so when we hear our Speaker of the House in the United States of America telling a professional athlete or Olympic athlete who has worked their heart and soul all their life to get on that stage, you're going to tell them what to say when they get there. You're going to tell them what to stand up for, what to speak, what truths to carry. How dare you? That's disrespectful to the athlete, but more importantly, that's disrespectful to our nation and all that have fought so hard to be the beacon of hope and the light for the world here in the United States of America.
Thank you so much, Jack. We're going to have more to talk about in terms of what you've seen, we've all seen, and then what we might take by way of steps to address. But Chad, let's shift over to looking at the manifestations of what this challenge is as it comes into our cultural institutions and our homeland here in the United States.
Well, before I do that, let me just key off on what Jack said when he talks about member of Congress telling Olympic athletes before they go over, don't criticize China. What world are we living in when we are telling U.S. athletes you can't speak your mind for fear of, I guess, retaliation or some type of physical harm? Well, here's an idea. If you really are that concerned, maybe we shouldn't have the Olympics there. If that's really a concern coming from the Speaker of the House, maybe there's bigger issues at play that we need to address instead of trying to dictate what our athletes should say. So that was my little tangent there. Look, from a homeland security perspective, I was there for all 4 years during the Trump administration, obviously serving the last 15 or so months as acting secretary. A lot of threats facing the homeland every day, border and immigration threats. You have just across the board, cybersecurity threats. What we said in 2019 actually, in 2020, the greatest threat, existential threat facing the homeland today is malign Chinese influence. And it's in every aspect of our economy today, whether you look at the threats to economic prosperity, whether that's intellectual property theft, whether that's goods that are coming in from forced labor, counterfeit goods. These are all suppressing U.S. goods and driving prices up, whether you talk about how they abuse our visa system, both for journalists and academics in the U.S. institutions, academic institutions. Confucius Institutes, I know the senator brought up as well, and the list goes on. And again, what we are seeing today as far as fentanyl in our communities, the number of illicit drugs in our community at an all-time high today. Well, guess what? Precursors from fentanyl almost exclusively come from China, through Mexico and up through the southern border. So there's a lot of threats when we talk about the homeland that originate out of China. So I think it's important for folks to realize that it's not overseas. It's not necessarily specifically a defense issue or a foreign policy diplomatic issue. It's here in our backyard. And I was just in the amount of foreign investment, direct foreign investment from China that I saw when I was at the department, the intelligence that I saw had grown exponentially over the last several years. They are buying property and assets around this country, some very close to military installations and the like. And they're not doing that because they want to buy a strip mall. They're doing that for a very specific reason. And I think as a government, we need to talk more about that. We tried to do that under the Trump administration. Unfortunately, I don't think you see or hear at all from this administration talking about that threat, specifically how it impacts Americans every single day. And I think, whether we're talking culturally or, things that affect Americans, specifically, I think it's very important to be upfront with the American people. They're big boys, they're big girls. They understand the threats out there, and they can alter their behavior, like we heard from Senator Scott. They could choose to support companies that are perhaps promoting Chinese products or not. But I think you got to give them all of the information, and I hope that this administration will take a different view than it has over the last 12 months and be a little bit more upfront with the American people.
Let me let everyone know one thing. I mean, you may or may not be familiar with the impact of something called TikTok, but I am every day. And so when I see our underserved kids, many of them fatherless, when they come into our center and I see these 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old girls on TikTok, half naked, it gets really real for me. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly how they're penetrating the hearts and minds of our little babies. And it should be a burden on everyone's heart. Because I'm telling you right now, many of us probably can protect our kids from that. We got 18 million fatherless kids in our nation right now that can't. We have a lot of vulnerable children right now being indoctrinated from this mess on TikTok. So don't misunderstand what we're up here saying. We're not attacking China or none of that. This is deeper than that. This is spiritual. They have gotten to the spirituality in the hearts of their own people, and now they're coming for our babies. And so think about that. If you are a nation that persecutes people based on religion, based on skin color, imagine what they're going to do when you allow them into the most vulnerable minds of our kids. They know what culture they're creating. They're controlling our culture right now. These children have a secret society that most parents don't even know and see. They have slang words and different sayings that they say to each other. And I'll give you a hint on one if you hear your kids saying it. It's called bodies. If you hear a little girl say how many bodies you got, or a boy how many bodies you got, that's how many people they've had sex with. And I didn't learn that until I start checking their TikToks. So I'm just telling you, I'm really real. I'll probably say things that a lot of people won't say. And that's why God gave me that grace. And I'm okay with it. So whoever's back there seeing anybody else, I don't care if you put my words on air, because it's that serious. This is a threat, and we are already in a spiritual war. God bless you.
Thank you, Jack. This is an important segue into what we can and should be doing to think about action in response. As we said, it's going to be a different kind of conversation. One of the things we hope to do is, through highlighting some of these hard truths, help Americans who don't plug into foreign policy conversations understand what's happening to them, and then hopefully, with the help of an all-of-society approach, help us protect the vulnerable among us, but then also make it less easy for the Communist Party of China to sow dissent and division among us while they impose uniformity on their own people and those that are willing to follow. They can be a threat to us without overtaking our power if they're successful in distracting, dividing, and perhaps poisoning our population, whether it's the poison of a virus, the poison of a fentanyl pill, or the poison of anti-social media in a certain sense. So thank you, Jack, for bringing it back to what the reality is of how we begin to respond. Perhaps you can help offer us some thoughts about how do we help reach those communities that don't tend to plug into a China conversation, that have plugged into America is bad and systemically flawed, but maybe they've even been told, whether it's because of very helpful teachers at school or other people in society, that China's got it all worked out. I mean, China not only gave us COVID, but apparently miraculously solved the problem to the point where Beijing is closed more than any part of human space right now because of the risk of the virus and the risk of free speech. But our youth and a lot of people who would not be treated fairly if they were to go to China seem to think the problem is here and not there. How do we get the conversation to them? And what can we do, as Senator Scott alluded to, get them in the conversation and start finding a way to push from the grassroots up? Because I think when it comes to policy this big, real change in this area, just like real change in politics, is not going to be solved from the top. It's going to be rebuilt on a new foundation from the bottom up. So welcome any thoughts you have, whether it's your fellow athletes, people in your ministry, whatever it might be. How do we take that conversation to those constituencies?
So first off, you know, any problem that you have before you that you can't see is always difficult to handle, right? It's difficult to grasp and to understand, really, and to teach. And that's why you have to have faith, right, in something. And I think that's why China has been successful in penetrating our hearts and minds, because they've been able to eliminate that faith component. We can't see all of these things. We don't see the fentanyl coming across the border, or them supporting all these groups to come in and flood our nation with all this sin, right? You don't see your kids on, whether it's TikTok or other social media outlets that may be promoted. So a lot of these things are happening out of our eyesight. And so we have to get back to truth in our nation to be able to dig deep. And if you are woke and you're standing for social justice, we'll be woke. Be woke about China. Don't be a hypocrite. Let's teach people what's really going on, and let's stop suppressing it. And our problem is our media. Our media doesn't address China. If the Speaker of the House won't address China, then you know that media outlets, individuals, our schools, our public schools, you won't go to public school and hear about the issues that we have with China. You think that would be normal history, right? You'd be able to learn and understand our relations with other countries, but they won't even teach this, even all the way up to our college level classes. So we are indoctrinating our children to overlook one of the biggest threats that we have to our nation today. It starts with that. And so it's a complex issue that I think we all have to take more seriously. And I'll tell you right now, I don't put enough attention on it. I need to put more attention on it. I think each and every one of us, whether it's teaching our children, letting them understand and be aware, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. And so you got to have a spiritual presence about yourself enough to be able to try to identify the things that are happening around you that your eyes may not be able to see. And I think if we can start speaking sometimes, not of the flesh, not of what we see here, but start speaking of spirituality and understanding, right? It does matter what's happening to the hearts and minds of the kids around us, even if it's not our neighborhood. It does matter what happened in the homes of our neighbors and the things that have happened around us. So I think it's time for an awakening in our nation, an awakening to understand that we are the light. And with that comes an obligation. America is the place that people seek for freedom, where people will die to be here. And so for us to be able to go on and take on a force like China, we have to all embrace and appreciate that. And instead of being so woke that we're against our own nation, let's take a step back and understand that we're not really woke, we're really asleep, and that China is coming in here and taking over our land and the hearts and minds of our kids. And so I think it's that reality that we need to get back to.
That's a beautiful message, and I hope it does go far and wide. I think that one of the things that you've also kind of brought into the conversation is the notion of what the government is doing over there, what the Communist Party is doing over there. It's just as bad for the Chinese people as it is for the American people and other people. And it's not a distinction that's easy to make all the time, but really they've already pulverized their society in a certain way to not stamp out dissent. Senator Scott mentioned what happened in Hong Kong. And if it happened there in that way, obviously it's been much more tightly enforced across the rest of China. You began a way of thinking creatively about how do we reach new audiences and approach these in different ways. Chad, if I could kind of build off of that and pivot into we're watching the Olympics and we want to root for Team USA. How do we do that the right way? And then how do we also then think creatively about taking this conversation where it needs to go out into America?
I think that's a great question. Let me just build off, Jack talked about an obligation. And I think, one of the obligations that we have, not only as a federal government, but obviously a people, is let's start focusing on the American people and what is going to put the American people first. And that is not only conversations like this, but that's actually doing things that we know we should be doing, but they're hard and they're tough, right? So we need to bring back critical manufacturing from China, right? We need to secure our supply chains. Obviously, during COVID, we saw that very acutely. What happens when you rely on overseas, Chinese, Asian supply chain? Not good. Harden our universities. Again, a lot of the propaganda starts, as Jack indicated, hearts and minds, supply chain. And in some cases, they're winning that in our universities. In universities, when supply chain students are learning, what is supply chain? China? Not good. And they're being told one thing versus the reality. And then, as Senator Scott said, holding these corporations accountable for what they're doing with a communist China, putting profits over the American people, over morality, and everything else. I think we need to start talking more about that. The federal government needs to start doing more about that. And I think then, obviously, Americans, we have our own people in the country, have our own obligations to do something about that and make some hard decisions and not buy those products, which are difficult to do. Trust me. Or turn your kids. I've got two boys, 15 and 14. Turn them off of TikTok until they hide it and find it again. But these are the tough things that you have to do. These aren't easy conversations. Try to have a conversation about Chinese malign influence with a 14-year-old who's worried about his baseball game the next day. It's like, right? But these are the tough things that you have to do at the end of the day. Let me pivot to your question though, Steve, which was, look, we have to support our athletes first and foremost. These are premier athletes at their given sport. They've practiced. They've done it day in and day out for years and years and years, and they get a very finite opportunity to showcase that talent. So we have to support them. We made a mistake. The IOC made a mistake of holding this Olympics in China. They just did, and we have to, you have to balance boycotting the Olympics, which I'm all for, with supporting our Olympians at the end of the day. And so I think there is a balance there, and everyone's got to figure out how do they do that individually. Instead of turning on NBC or USA or wherever the Olympics is on for 10 hours, on a Saturday, maybe you tune in for that 10 minutes that you really want to watch the snowboarding finals or whatever it might be, but then you turn it off because you're doing your own little part here to say, I'm not going to be part of this, embracing genocide and human rights abuses around the world. So I think it's an individual decision that we all have to do and make. But again, I've played a number of athletics over my career, not a professional. So I think it's important to support our Olympians at the end of the day, but also, again, hold a country like China accountable as well.
Excellent.
Well, we've, I think, had a couple of themes come up that I think are very, very important to maybe dive into just a little bit more. When we talk about these things that are critiques of China or the Communist Party of China, we at America First Policy Institute were also very, very focused on what is great about America. And so part of this conversation is, I think, getting America right is the first prerequisite to getting a China policy right. It's not something where the right understanding about what's happening in China is going to help us as much if we're not doing the things that are necessary to make sure that we're upholding the spirit of 1776 and what the true foundations and ideals are about a nation like ours. For those of us who've had opportunities to live and go to other countries, it's hard sometimes to remember that America really is the first human experiment of defining a country just based on a geography, sovereign boundaries. Sovereignty apparently was an old thing that now is a new thing, but sovereign boundaries, but then built around common purpose, rule of law, and equal treatment under that law. So that literally anybody that looks, feels, and believes like almost anywhere else can be at home being an American. That we're all brothers and sisters of God. We're all brothers and sisters as Americans. And when you go to other countries, say you go to a place like China, or you run into a cultural gathering in other parts of the world, it's a very different experience to see a government and a culture of that government defined by ethnicity first. And then its diplomacy extended by ethnicity first, where pressure is put on people that they need to speak up for their motherland at the expense of the interests of the country where they may have even been raised. Now, some of you may have followed the very curious personal and news story of an Olympic athlete that happened to be raised in California and then changed nationality apparently and participated on the Chinese team in the Olympics. Why would the Chinese team pick that athlete of all of the American athletes to try to bring onto the team? I don't know, but her last name is Gu. And there probably were relationships that were in there, but it's hard for people to truly change their frame to understand what it means to have a very enormous economy, the world's probably most creative and aggressive artificial intelligence, some of the most effective and well-practiced hackers, all working together to try to sort of weaponize this in a way that is to the advantage of the Communist Party. It doesn't necessarily benefit the Chinese people. It's for the Communist Party. And it's very much to the detriment of the United States. So this, I hope the conversation comes across clearly. Yes, we want to warn as we see the Olympics and we celebrate our athletes that we love and support anyone's right to do what happened through the miracle of 1776. That we need to get America right if we're going to get China policy right. And hopefully by taking this conversation, maybe with some hard truths, we can reinvigorate that conversation because it took us 50 years to get to the point where we're now seemingly willing to look at that was a bad bet. And the results are coming in. Senator Scott alluded to, we made this engagement approach with China under the theory that we would cultivate development and openness in China. The differences between our countries would narrow, opportunities for cooperation would expand. He talked as a businessman, former President Trump would talk as a businessman, but the results have come in and America's not winning that. And so we're gonna have to work together in new and innovative ways to bring back the winning, if I can steal a word from a common phrase. But the part that is American greatness and what AFPI does in that, maybe Jack, you run an effort here as a chair of an important center, maybe share a few thoughts about how this might fit into that initiative.
It really, our initiative is defined by this movement. It really is in a lot of ways. A lot of movements. We touch our center is a Center for Opportunity now. And I like to say we touch every center because American opportunity is at the heart and soul of what we're trying to accomplish at America First Policy Institute. But there's a few things that we believe in and that I personally really hold dear. And that's to get our country to the point where everyone has an equal access to opportunity. I'm not talking about the equity conversation. I'm not talking about the CRT conversation. I'm talking about true opportunity. And I can tell you how we can start to break that wall down. We want to break the wall down to where we can actually have a conversation about China without some folks thinking in their mind when they see a Chinese American having a bias towards them. You want to have the conversation about CRT and race without seeing a Black person and thinking that every Black person wants to push that doctrine, because that's not the truth. And us that look at America as that land of opportunity know that. But our issue is that we're conditioning our children to see skin color. Even if you're conservative or liberal, we're all doing it. You know why? because my little baby, who is half Black, a quarter Persian, 12% German, 12% Austrian, I have to have a conversation with my little man about what box he's gonna check when he gets to school or fills out an application or lives his life. He can't check a box that he's an American. He has to check a box based on his skin color. We have to end that. It's time to break that wall down in this nation and come together as one America, one people, and finally put America first. And we do that by getting that color box out of it. Once we do that, we can have these conversations with meaningful impact. Emotions can be removed, and you won't have people who are always constantly offended. I'll take it back to the Word of God real quick. The Word of God warns us that one day many will be offended. Lawlessness will prevail and hearts will grow cold. And the reason why the Word of God says that is because if you start to separate people, people are going to have a spirit of offense. It's a spirit. Understanding. The way you break that spirit is you stop dividing people and we start uniting people. So that's the first thing we need to do. And then after that, we got to get school choice. After we stop dividing each other up, we got to get school choice so that parents can control, understand, and have some say in what's being taught to their kids. We can't take on a force like China and all of these other threats that we have around us. If our children are reading and math proficiency level at the point of third world countries in a lot of places, we have a reading and math problem in America. She's looking at me because I gotta go in a second. And she knows I can talk. I start preaching, I'm sorry. If I start quoting scripture, you know I'm into it. But I mean that, and I'm passionate about that. And no matter what we do, everyone leave out of here and think about that, right? Think about all those families that got to have a conversation with their kid about which color box to check. Why?
That one really hits home. I have two adopted children that have grown up looking at a dad that doesn't look like them. They did had a little bit different mix to try to go through the menu. And it's hard enough to grow up under what people would consider to be normal conditions and struggle for identity. But the simple answer to some of that identity ought to be you identify as an American and you're part of that family. And it begins with protecting against attacks on family. So I'm really just grateful for what you shared on that. Chad, I want to pitch over to you to kind of bring us home. Right. So please hold on to the thought that you had. But if you could, as you bring us home, talk a little bit about how we at AFPI are approaching this differently. You have visibility into all of the many centers that we have and what some of our potential is there.
Well, let me just say, I've had the opportunity now to share a stage with Jack twice this week. So love the preaching. I could hear it all day. So thank you for that. Jack talked about opportunity, for our children. For me, that starts with making sure that they are protected and they have the ability to have that opportunity. So again, I can't take my Homeland Security hat off completely. We have to get real about this threat. We have to start talking about it. The threats, the greatest threat facing our country today is not in the Ukraine. It's not in Russia. It's from China. And we've got to start talking about it, thinking about it. The administration needs to put policies together. We need initiatives. We've got to start moving out on this tomorrow, not in 2 years, not in 3 years. We're already behind on a variety of different fronts, some of which I've mentioned, many of others I have not. If we want our children to have the opportunity that Jack talks about, Steve talks about, we've got to give them the atmosphere, the environment that protects them to do that. It gives them that opportunity from an economic perspective, or whether they're in school or keeping drugs off our streets, whatever it might be. We've got to start talking about this, and a lot of that threat is emanating from China. Again, to answer your question, Steve, look, we've got 21 different policy centers here at AFPI. which really, it spans a variety of initiatives. Every single one of them has a China issue, has something that they're dealing with that touches on China, which is exactly right. We brought Steve in to head this up. You know, whether it's homeland security or national security, school choice, Jack mentioned, healthcare, the list goes on and on. There's all issues that we're dealing with on how do we identify, address, and defeat that Chinese maligned influence in a variety of different sectors. So you're going to hear a lot more of that from AFPI over the coming weeks and months, not only through Steve's work, but also through our individual centers. It's something that we're very, bullish on and aggressive on. We'll probably take a little bit tact, just this conversation alone is probably not the same conversation that you're going to get from a lot of other groups around town. So we're going to take it a little different perspective, but I think we're going to open up a lot of people's eyes to the issue, and just really looking forward to doing that.
Thank you very much, Chad, for your leadership here and for joining us today, Jack. Every day is a good day to sit by you. And if I'm ever going to have to run into a crowd and try to break a wedge, I'm definitely going behind you. But it's a blessing to share the conversation with you. I want to personally thank Senator Scott for coming and addressing us and giving us some brain food to carry through. And I want to thank all of you for coming and participating here and through the live stream. Hopefully this is a conversation that will be ongoing. And we just, every day that we help put the American people first and give them the policies to help protect the American people first is a good day. So with that, God bless and take care.
Thank you.